Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 14. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host today. Joining me, we've got both of the boys on the line. Been talking for a little while, but let's act like we just hopped on and we're just saying good morning to each other. Teld, Chris, how are we doing today?
Good morning for the third time.
Yeah, when was the second time?
I don't know. I didn't actually say good morning at any point.
Oh, well, we're all here. I've talked to Teld actually quite a bit this week on account of we've been jamming Murders at Karlov Manor drafts in the main Discord, but I haven't heard much from Chris. Any
No?
Super Bowl plans, whatever that is?
No, I honestly, after the Ravens completely crashed in. So I don't care about football, like at all, full disclosure, but I will watch the Ravens because I'm originally from Baltimore if they're in the playoffs. But yeah, this particular game, I don't have a dog in this race. I probably would have been somewhat excited to watch it if the Detroit Lions had gone, because, I mean, like I said, I'm from Baltimore, so I just like an underdog team from a blue-collar city that's slowly losing residents. So if the Lions had gone, I would have been pulling for the Lions, because they've literally never won a Super Bowl, and they've actually been good for years recently, and they still have never won a Super Bowl. But, like, the Ravens and Detroit are out, so, like, I could kind of give a shit. And I'm going to be honest, also the, like, constant flashing to, like, Taylor Swift and her box that they do just, like, makes me want to, like, it's been amazing for business for the NFL. I'm sure they're fucking thrilled. I don't hate Taylor Swift because I hate her music, although I do not like her music. I hate Taylor Swift at this point because the world is, like, so insistent on trying to make me care about Taylor Swift. You know, like, I'm not plugged into what's going on in the world at all, and that's by design, but it's like, Taylor Swift farted and it smelled like perfume. Here's 10,000 words about it. And it's just like, God damn it. Like,
you know what they say, right? Haters gonna hate.
I'm not even a hater. I just, like, don't want to be bombarded with information about this person. Like, I don't think that's a whole lot to ask.
Chris, you just need to shake it off.
Yeah, just shake it off, man.
I hate you so much. This episode's over.
Sounds like you got some bad blood there, man. Teld, are you a Taylor Swiftie and or a Super Bowl person?
No, I'm neither of those things. I'm completely indifferent to Taylor Swift, and I used to watch football a good bit, but not really. Mm. There was this incident as a lifelong Georgia resident a number of years back, in which they blew the biggest lead in Super Bowl history, and I quit watching football after that. So,
you know what I actually like about the Super Bowl? The only thing that I enjoy about the Super Bowl in general is, like, hosting it. So, like, everybody will be watching the game, and I'll just be in the kitchen, like, frying wings and, like, putting beer on ice and shit like that because I like hosting parties, but.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining the Jank Tank podcast, sponsored by ESPN.
We're doing the Jank Diver Fantasy Football Draft today. Fantasy Football Cube Draft.
Yeah, we're drafting. Come join our drafts. No, actually, our topic for today. So Chris retitled this as Pitfalls of Polar Cards, which obviously means we're talking about snow cards in Cube.
Dang it, you beat me to the snow joke.
Oh, were you going to make the snow joke too?
I was going to make the same snow joke.
You were also going to reach for the low-hanging fruit there. Polarizing cards. So what I actually want to do before we get into the topic here, let's just make sure we're shouting out our Discord server, which has been popping off lately because of the release of Murders at Karlov Manor. I think we've had someone one or two people stream a draft every day since it's come out, and it's been really fun to have people kind of arguing and bickering over what their picks would be, but ultimately just drafting Boros.
Is the format any good?
It's kind of interesting. It's a contentious format, and for once, I'm not on the side of this format is god-awful. I don't hate it yet.
It's polarizing.
Drix has told me, one of our members has told me this is his LCI, that he just hates this format and never wants to touch it again.
No, it's too early to say something like that. Even if you were doing terrible in the first 3 or 4 days, you can't just call that on week 1.
I did for LCI. I'm just saying. I hated it. I hated it week 1, and I hated it through every single draft I did.
We probably don't want to get into it here, but let's just say the effect of play boosters has been noticeable.
Yeah.
And has affected drafting for this set specifically, but it's got some cool things going on.
White is exceptionally juiced. Like, it is so unbelievably juiced.
It may not be color balanced, but I don't know a set that has really been color balanced for a while. But yeah, by the time you're listening to this recording, it will be pretty much close to Valentine's Day, so you could show your love for Jank Diver Gaming by
Come play
joining
the
up
holiday
in the
cube.
Discord. Yeah, there's a holiday cube, which didn't get voted for on Friday, unfortunately. But yeah, there's a lot going on in the Discord. Come join us. Come give us your feedback on the cubes. Great place to come hang out. It's basically your online LGS at this point. Is what I'm calling it. Anyway, polarizing cards. That's the topic today. And what I actually want to do is, Chris, I want to throw this to you to kind of like frame what we're talking about and what polarizing means for us, because there's a lot of different definitions of polarizing cards. What we're not really talking about today are cards that just like make like polarizing opinions about cards. You know, like some people hate them, some people love them. That's not really the context of what we're talking about. So, Chris, if you could kind of clarify what we are and are not talking about in terms of polarizing cards for Cube to kind of set us off here.
Okay, so as Tim mentioned, it's not polarizing in terms of player opinion. It's polarizing in terms of gameplay, which we're going to be going into like the finer points, but broadly speaking, I think you can summarize polarizing cards as cards that have an outsized impact on the game depending on a number of contextual factors. Tim, you listed here in the notes like the initiative / monarch and vintage cube is polarizing to some players. It's not exactly what we mean here, although I will say that like those mechanics probably do kind of in some ways fit the definition of polarizing as we see it in those cubes, because, you know, if you're like playing against a control deck, it's going to be virtually impossible for them to take the monarch back from you if they're playing an extremely threat light deck, etc. But what we mean in a lot of cases is these cards like pretty routinely create like, that's kind of unbeatable for me, I guess, and everything that happened up until this point in the game is completely invalidated by that, which, you know, I like to call dog shit gameplay. So let's just get into some examples of what we're talking about. So, like, polar cards are not necessarily the best cards in the cube. It's concept adjacent, but it's like a little different from like snowballing cards or game accelerating cards, although you could kind of define those as polarizing. And how much cheat card snowball is really sort of a design decision that you have to make. But the way that I look at it with these polarizing cards is in certain contexts, in certain situations, they just make the games a lot less about player decision making.
Classic example of this that we just recently cut from the cube, just to put it as like a concrete example, would be Bitter Blossom against like a blue-black control deck. If you resolved the card against that deck, they just could not beat it. Nothing they could do. There was almost no way to beat that card. It's not specifically that the card itself is broken or too snowbally, although it was a pretty powerful card on the play. It's just that if you ever slipped it down on the first like 5 turns of the game against a control deck, they almost couldn't actually handle it.
Yeah, and actually, this is like an example without getting too deep into it before we start breaking it down. Like, black and blue just don't really have many ways, if any, that are efficient enough to be worth including that interact with enchantments. So, like, once Bitter Blossom sticks, there's not really a whole lot that you can do about it.
They also have difficulty racing, so like that's the way you can pressure Bitter Blossom, right? Is it puts a pressure on your life total. So if you have a very aggressive deck, you can punish your opponent for kind of spending 2 mana not impacting the board and then starting to lose life. But the blue-black control deck can neither do that. They can't race it, and they can't deal with the resolve Bitter Blossom. So it creates a game where the entire game revolves around this 2 mana card. And the cheaper these cards are, the better, the more impactful they tend to be, because they come down earlier, right? They're easier to slip in.
Yeah, if you're playing like a blue-black control deck or like a Grixis control deck, and your opponent sticks Bitter Blossom on turn 2, you immediately feel like I'm like 10% to win this game, maybe less. But anyway, let's talk about types of polarity and sort of what we mean, because polarity has like a couple of different sort of definitions. So the first is like card X is either dealt with immediately or it wins the game. So we kind of have an expression here. A lot of people hate on Baneslayers in Cube because they say, it just dies to Doomblade. But some Baneslayers we refer to as literally needs to die to Doomblade, because if it doesn't die to Doomblade immediately, it just completely takes over the game. And the Lucky Paper Radio folks refer to these as swingy cards, which is, I tend to use exaggerated language, so I would say that's a little understated. But, like, you take the point, right? So examples of this are, like, Bonehorde Dracosaur or Elder Gargaroth. And what you'll probably notice is both of these cards are Baneslayers that will murder your face, but also if your opponent untaps with them, they start generating card advantage. So like the second they replace themselves with other cards, essentially they're must kill game ending threats that if you deal with them later have already recouped value in addition to having like completely totaled your life total. So like look at Bonehorde Dracosaur. Like you play that, it's a 5/5 first strike that creates not only board value but also impulse draws cards every single turn. And if your opponent like removes your 5-drop with a 2-mana removal spell, then you just got tempoed pretty hard. Like you just got punished pretty hard. Your opponent in one turn cycle just generated 3 mana worth of tempo value on you, which is very difficult to come back from in a lot of cases. But if they don't remove it, it just completely takes over the game. So it creates these situations where you're exchanging resources, you're playing like an interactive game of Magic, and then boom, on this one turn, this hard Baneslayer comes down, and whether or not you have the removal spell, like, defines the entire game. Which, you know, like, you may be open to that as a designer, especially if you like those type of cards. The purpose of this episode is not to tell you that if you're playing polar cards, you're doing it wrong. It's just to kind of illustrate the issues that these cards have in gameplay that maybe some folks, especially folks who don't get to play test their cubes a lot, may not be seeing on a regular basis. But as a group that drafts our cubes really frequently, these issues come up constantly and like start to piss players off. Teld, you made a note here. Do you want to talk about the increasingly sort of pushed rate on these sorts of cards?
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue when you're talking about 5-mana cards because, you know, they do kind of have this incredible power level, but we're seeing more and more of these sort of polarized, and this kind of gets into like the dovetail into like these cards are snowbally, but cards like Inti and Luminarch Aspirant, like almost all the cheap cards in LCI that were good breaches. These are cards that if you don't have the removal spell for them on the turn they come down, you kind of just get pushed into the dumpster. Like you just get put in a trash can, right? And there's kind of this issue of, it feels like, especially with a lot of modern card designs, there's this old thing where you could skill test people with like how well you use your removal. And it sort of feels like now, because of how tempo heavy the game is and how dangerous every single threat is, you're supposed to just snap off your removal spell on almost the first target you get, as opposed to sandbagging it for later into the game. And that was something I noticed playing Cons versus Karlov, actually. Is in Cons, I felt like I got a lot of free wins because I sat there and held a Doomblade until my opponent went for some sort of risky play and then blew them out. Whereas in Karlov, it's like, one of the downsides of that format is I feel like you're just generally, for the first like 5 turns of the game, just supposed to snap off your removal spell if you've got it.
Yeah, and that creates these problems where, especially for control decks against like snowbally aggro threats these days, is essentially because you have to snap off your removal spells on the cheap snowbally creatures or you just die to them. Once your opponent plays their like cheap threats that you have to remove, you're going to run out of removal, and then when they stick an expensive card that steamrolls the game, you're not going to have the answer for it, right? So like one for oneing their hand isn't as effective as it used to be because it's like, okay, I remove your 1-drop threat, I remove your 2-drop threat, I remove your 3-drop threat. Oops, I don't have removal for your Shieldred, and now the game is over.
Yeah, I mean, just like it's kind of like you can imagine them also outside of a vacuum, right? So like, I mean, this is obviously a nutty draw, but if you went like turn 2 Inti, turn 3 Breaches, turn 4, you know, Chandra or Redcap Gutter Dweller into turn 5 Dracosaur, right? Just like imagine that curve. And it's like, if at any point you didn't have a Doomblade for the creature that they played, you probably just die, right?
Yeah, well, that's true. And the other issue with these increasingly like pushed in terms of rate, like cheap cards that snowball games, is that you have to have the removal spell for them. And if you do, you don't even generate any tempo because they're so cheap.
Right.
Like Adeline's another example. Like Adeline will solo the game, but if you kill Adeline with a Doomblade, you generate a very small amount of tempo. So it's like you literally have to answer it, but you're also not generating value for being able to answer it. Sorry, Tim, I keep cutting you off.
You're fine. These cheap ones also exacerbate the play versus draw problem, right? Because, you know, if Adeline comes down on turn 3 and you're the one on the play, Adeline comes down on turn 3 on the play, and you're the one who has to answer that, especially as a control deck. Like, you're the one with the counter spell. You have to respond to everything that they're doing, and the 2-drops and 3-drops aren't things that you can just let slip through like you might have been able to in the past. Like, I don't know, Vintage Cube, someone plays Porcelain Legionnaire on turn 2. Like, you don't necessarily have to counter that, if you're leading up to a Wrath or something like that. But if the person who's on the play with these snowbally cards that cost 2-3 mana, if you don't answer those, you are in trouble because they either generate immediate value or they're going to generate snowbally value if they do survive. And then, like you said, you're kind of forced into just the power level of cards is so strong that if your opponent plays a 2-drop, that 2-drop is going to be a quality enough card that you're going to have to kill it immediately. Like a Curion Beast Caller or something like that. You don't just get to let that sit there and like see what happens later on down the line. If you have the removal spell now, you use the removal spell now. And there's only so many like 1-for-1 removal spells that you can even have in your deck. So if your opponent just goes, 2, 3, 4, 5, like you said, and you answer number 2, 3, and 4 with 1-for-1 removal spells, eventually you're just not going to have that answer for the 5-drop. So, the cheap snowbally cards are almost even more egregious than the 5-mana ones, but they get balanced out a little bit by like another type of polarity, which we'll talk about, which is your cheap cards that aren't good when you play them on turn 5 and stuff like that. Whereas, your 5-drops aren't good on turn 2. So there's a little bit of polarity there. But
I also think it's a little interesting that the Wrath design has baffled me of the last couple of sets, because we got Sunfall, and that to me was like, obviously it's too far in the direction of like, it's one of the best cards in the
I think it's white. I think it might be White's best Wrath of all time. I don't know if that's like a hot take or not, but like a Wrath that also just kind of wins the game. Anyway, we've talked about Sunfall extensively elsewhere.
But then like we look at Murders at Karlov, and like they gave us Wrath minuses. They gave us a 5-mana Black Wrath and a 4-mana Wrath with downside. And it's like, I'm not even convinced Wrath of God would be particularly good anymore. And certainly Wrath of God that leaves your opponent equity is not, like, gives them value is not good anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, we should not go too far down this tangent, but I honestly, like, card design in the last few years, I think that they are just catering to the fact that a lot of players do not like playing against control. So they're kind of like nerfing control, and my perspective is like, why even have it as like an archetypal pillar of the game if you're going to inherently disadvantage it because people like to slam threats? But anyway, that's a whole like separate thing.
Well, it's not entirely separate, because a large percentage of cards that we don't include are not included because they specifically dunk on control. And control is already the worst archetype in our cube, which I found it really interesting because the last iteration of the Arena Cube was also very control heavy, and it felt like when we jumped up to 540 that should not be the case. But I also did see that they included cards like Nightclub Bouncer and Sune's Intervention, so maybe that had something to do with it.
Well, they didn't include the right density of cheap cards to make the aggressive decks like consistently curve out on you.
Oh yeah, that's right. You said that they included more, more 3-drops in White than 2s?
White had more 3-drop threats than 2-drop threats, which is, I mean, whatever. Maybe their design goals were to have a slower cube so people could do more dorky, slow stuff. Like, it's possible they did that deliberately, but from the way that we design, like, that's just completely ass backwards.
Well, we're talking about not jumping down the rabbit hole, and then someone decided bringing up Arena Cube was a good idea. But let's go ahead and move.
Teld.
So yeah, we've got the let's not talk about Arena Cube if we don't want to go down rabbit holes. So you've got the kind of like it either dies right away or doesn't die and carries the game on its shoulders, kind of like everything orbits around this card. Those are one type of polarity. But then you've got the other polarizing cards that they're polarizing in the sense that they're extremely backbreaking against a very specific deck, and then they're just kind of either mediocre or actively terrible against another deck. So if you're playing 3 rounds in a cube event and you have card X in your deck, like, you're going to get paired against someone where it's your best possible card on turn 2 or whatever, and then you're going to get paired against 2 other opponents where you are hoping you can loot it away or sideboard it out, right? And that's just, you would rather that card be something that's more universally playable against a number of different decks, right? You call these hosers usually, like it's almost always a control hoser, right?
Well, these days, yeah.
Yeah, these hosers that are specifically good against one strategy and actively terrible against other strategies.
Yeah, so there's a couple examples of this. The first is like Sword of X and Y type shit. So what it mostly points to, rather than going down a discussion of like the swords, is like protection in general is literally conceptually the most polar thing you can possibly imagine. Like protection against blue and black means absolutely nothing if you're playing against a green-white deck. And if you're playing against a blue-black control deck, it literally invalidates all of their interaction and their blockers, right? That's dog shit, as I like to say. That is complete dog shit. This is the most polar mechanic possible. It literally invalidates colors and does absolutely nothing against other colors.
Yeah, I think protection can only really be safely used when it's on a card like Feat of Resistance, where it's you get protection until the end of turn, and then
temporary.
And in that way it's like a reactive ability, or it's like a way to push back some blockers if your opponent has, all one color blocker. But like it's temporary, right? Exactly.
Because then it's filling the role of like a counter spell instead of like this card. You can't kill this card for the rest of the game. That, by the way, this is the reason we don't have Intimidate in the game anymore. Menace replaced Intimidate because Intimidate, if you put it on a green creature, it either mattered against people who were playing green, or it had literally no effect at all against people who didn't have green creatures.
Right. Same with Land Walk, right? Like Island Walk.
Land Walk too. These things that like, my opponent's playing a certain color, and I have a card that specifically references their color and shuts out their ability to interact with my card because I just happen to get paired against, that color.
Right. Another example that I can think of that's like tangentially related to this is like Veil of Summer.
Yeah.
Like it's very, very specifically just a blue-black, discard, removal, hate piece for those colors. And like they print things like this into Constructed for various reasons. But if you're not looking to play cards that like occasionally are completely excellent and occasionally are just dead cards in your hand, I suggest that you avoid shit like that. Like another example of polarity, and I think that this is the biggest one, is matchup polarity against certain archetypes.
And by that I mean we control.
Yeah, I mean these days it's like mostly control, but I'm going to provide like a variety of different examples. So the first example is Adanto Vanguard, which is 2 mana for a 1/1. It attacks as a 3/1, and you can pay 4 life to make it indestructible. A lot of control decks are going to get absolutely savaged by this card because they're not playing a lot of blockers. You're not pressuring their life total, so they're happy to pay the 4 life. And it's highly, highly resistant to most types of removal. On the other hand, it's like literally a terrible liability against other aggro decks because it blocks as a 1/1. You may be in a situation where you're not the person trying to race to the finish line in your aggressive matchup, and you almost never want to pay the 4 life to make it indestructible because your life total is of paramount importance. Like, I see Adanto Vanguard in a lot of cubes, and I think that's fine if your control decks are really, really good. But if they're not, then Adanto Vanguard is excellent against those decks, which is a disadvantage for them. It's terrible against aggro, and it's actually also pretty terrible against a lot of green decks because they're just going to land a blocker on like turn 2 or 3 that Vanguard can't attack into. And now it's true that those cards invalidate a lot of aggressive threats, but this literally doesn't even have stats to block, so it's actually useless.
I think Seasoned Hallowblade felt like the real fix on that one, where like it's just more generically flexible, and generally more playable, while still being kind of having that like obnoxious against control play pattern.
Totally, but the thing about cards like that, and also Guardian of New Benalia or something, that these cards require you to discard cards in order to make them indestructible, so they're annoying against control decks, but at least your Doomblade is going to trade for a card in their hand, which is still not great. But cards in hand in like a control versus aggro matchup matter a lot more than 4 life. Other examples of these cards, and I see people play these two cards in their cubes a lot, are Esper Sentinel and Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. So Esper Sentinel is literally a 1/1 for 1 that says when your opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, and notably that's on either turn, so it's your turn or their turn, you can pay 1 to avoid triggering this ability, but if you don't, they draw a card.
Notably, it's equal to its power, actually. So,
that's right.
So
that's
usually
right.
it's 1, but if you curve it into, say, a Luminar cast for it, you're now having a bad time.
Exactly. So, like, Esper Sentinel is excellent against blue decks and combo decks, but it does, like, literal fuck all against most green decks. And in addition to that, like, it's extremely punishing on turn 1. And then if you draw it later in the game and your opponent has plenty of mana to pay for the tax, it's literally a 1/1 for 1 at that point, which is a terrible card. So not only is it hyper effective against certain strategies and useless against other strategies, if you draw it late, it is like the worst draw in your entire deck. Another example that's kind of on a similar axis is Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which is 2 mana for a 2/1 first strike, and it makes all non-creature spells for both players cost 1 additional mana. This is also extremely punishing against blue decks, and doesn't really matter that much against heavy creature decks. Now, like a 2/1 first strike for 2 isn't an exciting rate, but in matchups where it's not completely punishing your opponent, it's still like a relatively useful body. But it's just another example of a card that is extremely, extremely effective, like to the point where it kind of shuts the game down. Because, you know, having to play your counters and your cantrips and stuff off curve is just completely and totally brutal, especially against an aggro deck that is just generating significant tempo with cheap threats every turn. And then in other matchups, it's just going to be like a 2/1.
I would push back just a little bit on Thalia, not too much. I do think it's probably its best against control, but it's also really, really good against mono red, because that's a deck that's using small creatures plus a split of removal of like interaction. So a lot of times mono red gets hit on both axes where like they need to remove Thalia and they have the tools to do so, but doing so requires them to time walk themselves. And so if they don't, they can never attack past it. It's a more generically applicable card than something like Esper Sentinel.
Sure, Esper Sentinel is way more specific, but the point remains that Thalia is like actively bad against green. It's just not good against green decks.
And I want to emphasize here real quick, you already said it once, but just to kind of drive this point home, is that this conversation, especially with the control hosers, is kind of indicative of where we are in our cube, but may not necessarily apply to something like, say, Vintage Cube, where these are the type of cards you need to kind of compete with the broken things that the control decks and, you know, Ancestral Recalls and Mana Rocks and stuff like that are doing in those formats. But for, you know, a format where control is, you know, medium at best, doesn't really have the tools to be a tier 1 deck, you don't also want to introduce cards into the cube that are pushing control down even further. So that's why we don't play Thalia. Esper Sentinel is just a miserable card in general, but Thalia, like, as good as it would be, it's not like it would be a bad card. It's just it would exacerbate some of the problems that we have with control decks in our format.
Well, I think actually, like, at least in our format, and I think increasingly in other formats, because they're printing a bunch of really excellent non-creature white spells. Like, if you play Thalia in an environment where you're playing, like, a decent number of white planeswalkers, which tend to be among the best planeswalkers in the game, Wedding Announcement, cards like that, it can actually punish you, too. The next example of cards like this are, like, the new Thrun, which I believe can't be countered. It can't be interacted with by non-green spells or abilities, and it has indestructible on your turn. Carnage Tyrant, hexproof, and can't be countered. And like one of the most egregious examples is Toski. So these cards, they can't be countered, which is like, it's literally like, it might as well say on the card, like, fuck blue, because it can't be countered, and there's only basically one color that does that.
It doesn't even get around half the white counters because Reprieve doesn't actually counter it, just returns it to your hand.
Which is, kind of funny. So they can't be countered. They're either hexproof or indestructible, so once they land, you can't even clean them up with removal. And in the case of Toski, so Toski is a 1/1 for 4 with can't be countered and indestructible. It must attack every turn, but it also says every time a creature does damage to your opponent, you draw a card, which means if you get in with 3 creatures, you draw 3 cards. Toski comes down against like another green deck, and there's just like blockers for it, and you might not have good attacks with your other creatures. Toski comes down against a control deck. It can't be countered, it can't be removed, and control decks play the smallest number of blockers, at least in most unrestricted cube environments. I don't want to make a blanket statement, which also means that you're not going to have as many blockers for the cheap creatures that they played earlier, so then Toski is just going to start drawing like a shitload of cards. And the way that control decks tend to win is they work to 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 you, generate card advantage, and when Toski's just drawing a million cards and can't be removed, like it just completely neuters the opposing blue deck. And then the last example I want to talk about, and I think this just kind of goes for gigantic life linkers in general, is like Wormcoil Engine. Like Wormcoil Engine is, at least in like fair environments, is like always a pretty powerful card. You know, it's gigantic, it has lifelink, it has death touch, which very rarely matters, but it does matter sometimes. And then when it gets removed, it splits into the same amount of power and toughness over 2 bodies, one of which has death touch, one of which has lifelink. We've been talking a lot about cards that are very good against control and not really good, or blue specifically, and not really good anywhere else. But Wormcoil is actually kind of the opposite. So Wormcoil is one of those cards that can get exiled by a really wide range of white removal, but it's brutal against black control decks because, you know, sticking it with a Doomblade is like literally not removing any power or toughness from the battlefield. But also, like, a lot of blue counterspells tax your opponent's mana, which make them pretty weak against cheap plays later in the game. But Wormcoil Engine is going to get censored on turn 6, right? So Control has the most answers for Wormcoil Engine, but, like, imagine Wormcoil Engine against mono red. Like, Wormcoil Engine stabilizes so hard, is so impossible to remove with damage-based removal, etc., that, like, your opponent can resolve this when they have like 6 life, and if you can't burn them out that turn, you kind of just cannot win.
One of the most common, to point how bad this is for you, is one of the most common ways you beat Wormcoil Engine is to flunge, and then you kill your own creature after they block. Yeah, it's just like that. That's the straits, the dire straits the card like Wormcoil puts you in. Now, the flip side of that is you do usually have to work to survive to turn 6 or to 6 mana to get the Wormcoil Engine into play. But like once you get it there, it's pretty hard to beat if you're remotely close to stabilizing.
We're going to talk about this momentarily, so I won't get super far into it. But you know, once you get up to 6+ mana cards, that's usually where you kind of accept some of these polarizing cards. But Wormcoil specifically is colorless, which means that every single deck, at the very least, if they're not mainboarding it, they could just sideboard into it, and there's no restriction on being able to play it, whereas like the Grave Titans, Inferno Titans, and stuff like that are going to be locked to a very specific, you know, style of deck.
Right. So moving on, another type of polarity is cards that are fantastic if you play them on curve, and then if it's later in the game, they're just actively bad draws. And I also added a note here that a lot of these cards are exacerbated by the play draw. So if they're really fantastic if played on curve, like not only do they really want to be played on curve, or otherwise they're just not very good, but they're exceptional on the play because you're curving out before your opponent is curving out. So a really good example of this is a card like Magda. Magda is a 2-mana 2/1, which is a really bad rate for a body. But when it attacks, it creates a treasure token, and then it has some like dragon text that doesn't really mean anything outside of specific contexts, right? Magda can snowball a game if you play it on curve, especially against a deck that's not playing cheap blockers, because accelerating your mana while chipping in damage. Like if you go 1-drop Magda, it gets an open attack, and then you slam Chandra on turn 3. That's a brutal, brutal curve. But if you draw it later in the game and there's like a fairly littered board state or there's good blockers, it's literally a 2/1 for 1, which is an absolutely terrible card.
I'm sort of the opinion that most of the time what Magda does is just you could play Charming Scoundrel and it would be about the same on turn 2. Like a little worse because you're not going to get that takes over the game snowbally effect, and then just much better on every single other turn of the game. Like, I think outside of specifically turn 2, I would rather play Charming Scoundrel. I think that card is actually like kind of slept on as just a pretty flexible card.
Another card that we mentioned earlier is Bitter Blossom. Bitter Blossom is like still good against aggressive decks if you play it early, because sometimes like you're taking 1 damage from making the 1/1, but it's actually trading with X1 creatures, so it's actually saving you life while impacting the board.
Or you take 1 damage to make a dude, and then you put it in front of an X, like a 3-power creature, and you've effectively gained 2 life.
Yes, but as we were talking about earlier, it's very, very difficult for some cards to interact with. The other thing about Bitter Blossom is, unless you're playing like a sacrifice deck that can really make use of the bodies to do really powerful combo-esque things, Bitter Blossom is actually just not a fantastic draw on like turn 10. If you think about it this way, like if I play it on turn 2 and the game goes to 7 turns, it was 2 mana to pay 5 life and make 5 1/1 flyers. If I play it on turn 10, the game might end in 2 turns, and then it was 2 mana to take 2 damage and take 2 1/1 flyers, which is a lot less powerful. So it's significantly better the earlier you play it, and some decks just can't really interact with it or race it. So that's like another example of this type of polar card. And what you'll probably notice is, it's actually kind of funny, at the beginning of the episode we said we weren't really going to talk about snowbally cards, but then we ended up talking about snowbally cards a lot. But it's an example of a card like Inti and Aspirant and Quirion Beastcaller. One of the through lines with these cards is they're cheap plays that generate way more stats over the course of a game than 2 mana should be able to create.
Inti, maybe not specifically, but I think I would put Luminarch Aspirant and Beastcaller. They're exceptionally powerful, but I would put them in the snowbally but not polarizing category, right? Because they don't like have a specific matchup where they're just, oh my god, this card is completely insane. They're just good in every matchup because they're more stats than you should reasonably have on a 2-drop.
Sentinel of the Nameless City falls into this category.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's good against aggro, but it's also good against control, and it's also good against mid-range. It's just like a generically...
And the stat line is bigger than it should be.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we were talking about sort of the difference, right? Is these cards don't have a matchup where they just roll them. I mean, like, obviously, Luminarch Aspirant's better against your opponent's aggressive deck, or like creature deck, right? Where they're trying to block you and you can outside your creatures. But that's not polarizing. It's just good there.
Two things. First off, the opposite of this is true too, right? Like, if you're playing a bunch of 8-drops and 10-drops in your cube, those are polarizing in the sense that most decks can't even cast them. You can't cast them, and they do nothing until you get to the point where you're able to somehow generate 8 to 10 mana, which is why you don't see cards like Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, and Cityscape Leveler in our cube. We have Ugin, but that's mostly there at this point for, people just enjoy the card existing. The question I wanted to ask you guys is, where do Mana Dorks fall in this category? Because they kind of fit the definition of what we're talking about as a card that's fantastic to play on curve, but terrible if played later on. Like, it's literally the definition of a Mana Dork, but we still clamor to play as many Mana Dorks as we want. Obviously, it's pivotal to, like, Green's strategy in Magic as a whole, but would you classify like Llanowar Elves as a polarizing card?
That's actually something we're going to be exploring right in the next section.
I'm just setting you up for the segue.
Oh, nice. Okay, I'm a dummy. I don't pick up on things.
I didn't know we were talking about it in the next section, but since we're here,
So I just want to summarize real quick. The definitions of like polar cards that we just went through are color hosers, archetype hosers, and play draw snowball like dependent cards is kind of the 3 broad categories that we're discussing here. So when are polarizing cards acceptable in your environment? I think there are a couple categories of these. So the first is like control silver bullets. So control needs to run silver bullet cards, and they compensate for this by running enough card selection to find them when they're needed. And like a classic example is Wraths. Like historically, we can have a whole like side discussion that could be a topic or a subtopic in and of itself, whether or not Wraths are still like particularly good. I don't want to get into that here. But historically, like control decks have needed to mainboard Wraths because they're really soft to decks that just curve out a bunch of really efficient threats really fast. And if you play a Wrath and you clean up 3 creatures, not only did you sort of reset the game, but you also generated 2 cards worth of virtual card advantage.
Which is offset by the fact that all 3 of your opponent's cards also drew them a card. So actually, you're just down a card.
Sure. Well, like I said, I don't really want to get into that here. But the point is, like, you kind of need to main board Wraths because you need to be able to clean up boards that you can't one for one with removal. But, like, obviously into another control deck, a Wrath is a garbage card, and you're going to be boarding it out. Control Silver Bullets, I think they're acceptable as polarizing cards because you just need a selection of different answers in your main board to have game against a variety of different archetypes in your game one. And I think sideboarding is really important in Control, maybe more so than in other archetypes. Another example of this, and this is also like another Control quote-unquote silver bullet, is like highly conditional cheap removal. So at least in our cube and cubes like the Bun Magic Cube, which is curated by the Lucky Paper radio hosts, if you have a bunch of cheap curve out sort of threats that pressure your opponent's life total really fast, you know, you want to run cards like Fatal Push and Disfigure and things like that, so you have early answers to the cheap plays that are going to take over the game. But like Disfigure is like pretty inherently bad against sort of larger green decks unless you're like literally sniping a dork on turn one. If you draw them later, they're effectively useless. But in fast environments, control decks basically need to be mainboarding them because if you don't have cheap answers to efficient aggro decks, you're just going to get steamrolled, right? And then like in certain matchups, you're going to board them out.
These are like your portable holes, your glass casket type cards, your cut downs that only affect like the lower end of an opponent's curve and have literally no way to touch, you know, like a 6-drop or 7-drop, whereas something like Bloodchief's Thirst, you know, can catch the early game creatures and the late game creatures, but you still need your portable holes and stuff, you know?
Right. Yeah, and I love Thirst for that reason. But, you know, like I've been saying, I think like cards with some amount of polarity are acceptable in Control because you have to cover a bunch of different bases main board for game one.
I also think the sort of nature of one-for-one interaction keeps it from being polarizing in the sense that we have been discussing, in which it like takes over a game, because that's like one of the qualities all of these polarized cards have, right? Is the game revolves around them, and no matter how good cut down is against your opponent, the game isn't revolving around do they have cut down in most situations.
Yeah, that's part of it. And one thing that I want to point out about the two examples that I just gave, which are Wraths and highly conditional cheap removal, is one of the reasons you want to main board them in control decks. And I don't want to generalize for everyone's environment, right? Because there are different designs with different parameters. But I'm talking about sort of a quote-unquote classically designed cube where aggro is well supported. These two card types are at their most effective against aggro. And like I know that this is not like necessarily true. There's a Lucky Paper Radio episode kind of like breaking down rock, paper, scissors and how it doesn't like universally apply to all cube environments. You should go listen to that if you're interested in that topic. But these two cards that you want to be mainboarding are really at their best against aggressive decks. And the reason you want to play them is Control in a lot of environments tends to have its softest matchup against aggressive decks. So you're sort of hedging against the decks that are going to be the most effective against you generally and get under you. And if you don't have those cheap answers and those Wraths, if you try to like one for one an aggro deck with counter magic, you're going to have a really bad time.
The Wraths can even, I mean, this is the other layer too, is they can be played around relatively easily during the draft portion if you're willing to spec on stuff. For example, one of the best cards against Control out of the sideboard for aggressive decks is Reckoner Bankbuster, where if you bring that in, you just slip it down, you know, early into the game, and then even if they Wrath you, you can follow it up with 4 damage to the face. You've got some card advantage to recoup the Wrath. So you can do that. You can do Planeswalkers. There's a number of tools that you have access to that you can, during the draft portion and sideboarding portion of the game, you can configure your deck in a way that you are less soft to Wraths, right? You can take out your creatures that are very, very bad against them.
Saying polarizing cards are maybe a little more acceptable when the tools are there to combat them, whereas something like Toski.
Yeah, like what do you do? You know, what do you do against
like,
Toski?
What is your sideboard plan against Toski? You know, as the control deck, what are you picking up in the draft to not die to an indestructible, uncounterable creature that draws a bunch of cards?
I really hope you picked up Disfigure and then drew it. that's your game plan.
Yeah, minus X effects in black and things like Deck and Stone and white will deal with Toski, but you literally have to have them in hand.
So I jumped the gun a little bit on a couple things in this episode, but you wanted to mention like Thalia and Vintage Cube, which we talked about, and the Mana Dorks here, like as examples of other cards that are acceptable types of polarity.
Right. So one of the reasons Thalia is like so punishing against like slow non-creature based decks is it makes them even slower, which is a massive, massive problem against aggressive decks, right? That's sort of the example that we gave earlier. But in completely degenerate cubes where your opponent can like combo off on turn 3 and win the game on the spot, Thalia is kind of necessary for an extremely fair white aggressive deck because it prevents them from doing that as quickly, which gives you time to win the game. And Vintage Cube is so full of extremely powerful degenerate strategies that Thalia is like totally acceptable because the aggressive deck literally needs to slow down the combo deck in order to race it.
It's not even combo decks anymore. Even the mid-range decks. So, like, some of the most powerful threats in the format are stuff like Fable the Mirror Breaker, Minskin Boo. You know, these are cards and boxes are in so many decks. You know, these Thalia, an early Thalia is able to really just hamper your opponent, particularly if you've got the Mox yourself, so you can play it on turn 1. It does have this sort of polarizing effect, but like you said, the decks in Vintage Cube are doing degenerate, extremely powerful things. So the Thalia kind of ends up being the good guy.
Yeah, exactly. So like that's an example of, degenerate strategies are so quick that Thalia is like almost a necessary card for white fair decks, but in environments where it's just hosing control decks, like I find it to be unacceptable. Another card type that is inherently very polar are 1-drops in general, and that includes mana dorks. So they're pretty terrible draws in the late game. Like if you're playing mono red and it's turn 6 and you top deck Monastery Swiftspear, like that's not what you were looking to top deck, right? You were looking to top deck your Hell Rider, your Glory Bringer, etc. And mana dorks aren't really like aggro cards, but they can sort of be conceptualized that way because accelerating mana means more powerful threats are coming down earlier, which is kind of like cheap plays like 1-drops and mana dorks are kind of inherently tempo positive plays if you can follow them up or curve out.
Sure, like without beating around the bush on that, I mean, like one mana mana dorks are early into the game. If you play a mana dork on turn 1, it is essentially suspend 1 time walk, right? Like if you untap with it, you time walk. You get a free turn.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a very, very good way to put it. But like they're really bad draws in the late game. So why are they acceptable as polar cards? Well, accelerating green decks and aggressive decks in a lot of cases need to generate that tempo early in order to have their best proactive draws. This is like a side topic, but I will say, like, I'll see people play like one mana dork in their deck, and I honestly think if you have like 1 copy of Llanowar Elves, you should probably just cut it because the likelihood that you're going to have it on 1 is really low, and then it's going to be a terrible draw late. But you want a density of these cards, right? In certain decks, you want a density to maximize your potential for having one on turn 1. And the difference, like, and Teld, like, I know you know this very well, there are a lot of aggressive strategies where, like, if you don't have a 1-drop, like, your percentage chance to win that game is significantly lower. So you want a density of these because this is what these decks are doing. And while they're bad draws later, you're trying to end the game fast enough that, like, the likelihood that you're going to draw multiple 1-drops later in the game is significantly lower. And frankly, if you're playing a mono red deck and it's like turn 12 against like a big mid-range deck or a control deck, you're probably kind of fucked already.
Yeah, when your game plan is to end the game by turn 6 and ideally on like turn 4 or 5, I mean, it doesn't really matter if your card is not good late into the game because there is no late into the game. You played your cards. It's like the 1-drops have an advantage of being able to fit in extra spots on your curve too. So like a lot of times in your mono red deck, you'll play, multiple 1-mana cards in a turn or a 2-mana card and a 1-mana card. And these cards just let you find more ways to maximize your mana. And again, you're really not aiming for the game to go very long. Like you're really wanting the game to be over, ideally like turn 5, turn 6 Goldfish. If the game goes longer, you've got a couple of tools to go a little longer, but there isn't a lot, right? The mono red decks really are just, I mean, they're a firework, right? They're a big flash and then it's over. You either won the game or it's over.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, this is exactly why a card like Novice Inspector, Thraben Inspector is as good as it is because you get it on turn 1, it's good, but it's not a dead draw later in the game. Like, it just replaces itself and stuff like that. And then you have your 1-drops like Knight of the Ebon Legion, I think, is a good example of like a non-polarizing 1-drop, because that card is just kind of good on turn 4 too, you know, if you can slip it in alongside other stuff. So
Sleep Curse Fairies in that camp as well, where it's like,
one drops that give you like actual presence in the late game instead of being the type of 1-drop that needs to get in early to do something. Basically the non-aggressive 1-drops most of the time. But I do like Chris's point here that like a single 1-drop in your deck is probably way more polarizing than like 5 or 6 1-drops in your deck, because the density of those cards kind of takes away the polarity if they're that important to your deck. You know?
Well, I mean, if I'm playing a Celestia deck or a Gruul deck and I've got 1 mana dork, I'm still just jamming it in my deck. Like, I'm like, you know, I
think that's an interesting thing to get into, like strategically, that we probably don't need to go into here. But I kind of get Chris's point that like if you don't have the density of a card that's that important to have at a certain part on your curve, like do you even play it at all? But that's a strategy thing we don't need to necessarily dive into right now.
Yeah, Tim, do you want to take this next one? This is your note.
Yeah, well, this is kind of something I wanted to ask you guys is like, at what point do you stop calling a card polarizing just because it's super powerful and game warping, you know? And I think the answer is like at 6 mana and above. We talked about Wormcoil Engine, but part of the reason Wormcoil Engine is a problem is because it's colorless and every single deck can play it. But when you talk about like big stabilizing cards, you know, take an R-Cube, for example, Titan of Industry, Grave Titan, Inferno Titan, those feel like they fit the definitions of what we're talking about in terms of like, here's a game that was going very smoothly for your opponent, and then you resolved Inferno Titan 3-for-1 them, and you're going to kill them on the following turn, and they have no way to come back from that, right? That's polarizing in the sense that it flipped the game around, but it's not polarizing, I don't think, in the sense that like it's unacceptable for the cube because it's a 6-drop, you know? Once you get up to 6 and above, especially Ugin, think about Ugin the Spirit Dragon and how much that card completely warps a game when it comes down. But it's 8 mana, right? You accept the fact that spending 6, 7, 8 mana on a card should do something game warping. So it was kind of a point I wanted to make as a question to you guys, leading into kind of like our final little conversation here is like, what is acceptable polarity when it comes to game warping cards at the top end? And I think the answer is like at 6 mana or above. We talked about the Dracosaur, we talked about Elder Gargaroth. To some extent, you could talk about actual Baneslayer Angels and stuff like that, right? Like, those are 5 mana cards, and it feels like they come down on turn 4 very often with treasures and green decks being able to ramp into stuff like that. It feels like that's the point in the game where, like, it's have the answer or don't have it. I don't know. I'm waffling a little bit on what I'm trying to say here, but, like, 6 mana and above, is that the acceptable point where we start to say, like, okay, a card at 6 mana and above is supposed to be polarizing?
Yeah, I think so. I think 5, like, you see aggressive decks. You know, if I play a red deck, unless I have just the stone nuts and my deck, like, curves out at 3, I'm probably putting a card like Glorybringer in my deck, for example. I would play 1 copy of that as just, like, a late game, you know, give me a chance to win a game that I'm probably out of. So I think, like, you can kind of get to 5 without working for it too hard. You know, you obviously need to put enough lands in your deck and all that. But, I mean, for the most part, I think 5 is kind of the limit of, like, you didn't have to work too hard to get it.
So, a couple things. So, you mentioned Bonehorde Dracosaur, right? I think that's inherently swingier than something like Grave Titan for the following reason. Like, Dracosaur comes down, and then if you untap... Like, if you untap with Grave Titan, it's also, like, fucking insane, right? So, they're similar there. But the big difference is that if Dracosaur dies to Doomblade, like, you really kind of shit the bed because you're really behind now, especially if your opponent, like, let's say your opponent, like, plays something on 3 main phase that generates tempo, and then you tap out for Dracosaur and they pop it for 2, like, you're in really serious trouble, right? Mm-hmm. If Grave Titan eats a Doomblade, it already generated 2 2/2 zombies. So is getting your Grave Titan killed with a Doomblade, like, rough? Yeah, it is. But some of the value of the card sticks to the battlefield, whereas something like Dracosaur is way more swingy in both directions because it's, like, completely invalidated by cheap removal. I think the other difference between something like Grave Titan and Wormcoil Engine, which is an example that we talked about earlier, is that if I'm playing an aggressive deck with, like, a suite of removal, like, don't get me wrong, Grave Titan stabilizes extremely well because even if you blade it, you know, it leaves behind a couple 2/2s that can block. But, your opponent can cast Grave Titan, and if you're far enough ahead, you can still alpha them, like attack with 5 creatures, get in for damage, and finish them with a burn spell, for example. Like, aggro decks, especially red aggro decks, literally cannot do that against Wormcoil Engine, because even if you blade it, it splits into 2 larger blockers than what Grave Titan leaves behind, and one of them still has lifelink. So, like, I think Grave Titan and Inferno Titan can be beaten if they're resolved, if you're far enough ahead. There are very few situations where you can get far enough ahead in an aggressive deck that you can beat Wormcoil Engine.
Sort of. I think if you're far enough ahead, you just attack and bolt your dude. But sure, I get what you need, like, because if you have the dude blade, just bolt your own dude, like we talked about earlier.
Right, but you still have to be wide enough, right? You still have to be wide enough to do that.
Yeah, but you have to be wide enough to attack into Grave Titan and 2 zombie tokens as well. So, like, I'm assuming in the spot we're talking about, we have, like, 6 creatures in play, because otherwise this play doesn't make any sense.
Right, no, that's totally fair, but in the Wormcoil example, you want to, like, blade your dude so they don't gain life. In the Grave Titan example, you want to blade the Grave Titan because you have significantly better attacks. Like, you're not 2-for-1ing yourself, like, which against Wormcoil Engine is fucking brutal. So all I'm saying is, like, Grave Titan is an excellent stabilizer against aggro. Like, I'm not saying Grave Titan is not an excellent stabilizer against aggro. Inferno Titan also is, for what it's worth. Sometimes Inferno Titan comes down, kills 2 creatures, and, like, you just can't win from there. But, like, the difference for me is that, like, Wormcoil is even more brutal against aggressive decks by, I think, a significant margin.
Sure. So I actually want to talk about another giant lifelinker for just a second, because this is one that I've had some thoughts about. What do we think about the long term for Aclazotz? Because doesn't it meet almost all of the conditions that we're talking about, while also being 5 mana and also taking over the game and also being extremely difficult to kill and also having a lot of value if you untap with it?
Yeah, but it doesn't have any ETB value. It's only a 4/4, so there are red spells that can kill it and exile it. Paying the cost to bring it back is not insignificant, and because it isn't gigantic, it doesn't generate as much of a life swing as Wormcoil, not to mention the fact that there are plenty of 4-power threats in aggro decks that can attack into it, and, like, sure, they're going to trade and your opponent's going to gain 4 life, but there are very few aggressive threats that can even trade with Wormcoil in combat, so I think it's way less egregious, not to mention the fact that it generates no ETB value.
I think part of the problem with, like, Dracosaur and Gargaroth specifically is that those play offense and defense at the same time. Like, assuming Dracosaur lives a turn, Gargaroth lives a turn, like, they generate blockers while also jamming in, whereas Aclazotz doesn't necessarily do that. I think it can make bats too. Plus, Aclazotz, like, it does come back later in the game, but like, the first time you activate the ability, it comes back tapped. So, like, there's at least there's like a reprieve between when you kill it the first time and, like, the next time
it was the best card in LCI draft, so I just assume it's going to be too busted at some point, but maybe LCI hurt me.
If our aggro decks are constantly brick-walled by Aclazotz, that's something that we would address down the line. So far, I don't know that that's been happening or not. It has kind of the hallmarks of one of these, like, oh, I untapped with this, I stabilized. That's
kind of what I'm getting at. And not necessarily that it's currently problematic, but doesn't it have all the hallmarks of cards that we previously excluded?
It could, and we'll that's the type of thing we want to keep an eye on, right? That's the reason we cut cards like Gargaroth from our cubes. So if it falls into those play patterns, we would certainly look at it that way too.
Yeah, I totally take your point, Teld. Comparing it to something like Gargaroth, though, like, Gargaroth not only can gain life, but it can draw cards or make blockers depending on what needs to happen, and for whatever fucking reason, it also is gigantic and has vigilance and reach, which is totally absurd. So I think Gargaroth is, like, more punishing against aggro, but generates significantly less long-term grindy value if it eats a Doomblade. So I find it to be a less polar, but, like, I take your point that it's probably at its best against decks where the life gain really matters.
Yeah, I think the last thing I wanted to ask is, we do include some cards specifically based on the power of an archetype. So, for example, the card that comes to mind is Scarab God, because Blue-Black historically has not been one of the best decks, and Scarab God is a card that can utterly take over games. What are our thoughts on that one? Like, just as far as, is that an acceptable spot to have a polarizing card when you're talking about, like, a potentially weaker archetype?
I mean, Scarab God immediately brings me right back to Aclazotz, where, like, you try to kill it the first time. Like, obviously it's a lot harder because it's a 5/5 for 5 or whatever, and it just comes back the next turn. But I don't know. I've never felt like Scarab God was game warping in the sense that like people can't beat it, but it is one of those cards where you stick it on 5, you don't have an immediate answer.
Well, Gargoth and Dragosaur weren't problematic that you couldn't beat them. Like if you untap with Scarab God, you're not losing.
Well, that's fair, but I think what's different about Scarab God is if you're really behind, then you might not have time to start recurring creatures, and like it does go back to their hand, but if you remove it, they have to spend 5 mana to play it again. I agree with you insofar as like if you play Scarab God at parity, or let's say you manage to Wrath like the turn before, and your opponent's aggressive deck like has to spend their next turn kind of rebuilding, like Scarab God is like truly unbeatable in a lot of scenarios.
Yeah. And I'm not saying it's too good. I'm just saying, like, Scarab God, again, is another one of these cards that meets these definitions of cards like Gargoth, like Bonehor Dragosaur. Gargoth, I get, is a little bit of an exception in that it has Vigilance. But, like, Scarab God does have that fact of, like, if you untap with it and you are not so far behind that there was no card in Magic that would have realistically caught you up, like, you're just...
Other than Wurmcoil.
Yeah.
I think a core difference there, unless you're playing Scarab God on 9 mana and you can activate right away, which does happen sometimes, I think a core difference there is that, like, Scarab God does not necessarily just brick wall combat. It's probably going to eat a blocker, but Wurmcoil gains life if you attack into it. Grave Titan and Inferno Titan take out blockers or make it difficult to attack. Dracosaur has First Strike. Elder Gargaroth triggers if you attack into it. If your opponent sticks Scarab God without the mana to activate it, it's basically for that turn like Gigantopede, Sure. Like you get a moment where like, okay, my opponent played a 5/5 for 5. That's not the most unbeatable card. I need to start warping a game plan around it, and part of that game plan for the aggro decks is to push in as much damage as possible that turn, and then, get them within burn range, get them within range of like whatever White's card draw is going to do, whereas you don't get that attack very often. I guess with Dracosaur and Scarab God would be the similar situation, but you don't get to make that attack into Gargaroth or Wurmcoil Engine or something that's just gonna, put your opponent even on life or maybe gain them life if you try to make that attack. So one of the usual ways, like you said, to get around your opponent's big bomb that doesn't immediately generate value is to just try and flunge into it and get them as close to dead as possible, if not dead. And you can't do that against some types of cards, but you can do that against Scarab God. But yeah, Scarab God untaps if they're not immediately dead or, hanging on by a thread. They come very close to just winning the god with Scarab God, or winning the game with Scarab God, and it can be polarizing in that sense, but I don't think that's the 100% play pattern for Scarab God. I think a lot of times it's either too late or 5 mana 5/5 isn't going to quite do it. Things along that line. I think it stabilizes without punishing the turn it comes down, and I think that might be the difference maker.
Yeah, Teld, I completely agree with you that Scarab God is one of those cards where if you're like at parity or you're ahead, it just slams the door so hard.
But no, like Scarab God isn't like some sort of unbeatable problematic card. It's just, I'm just thinking is it acceptable that we have a card like that, like Akazot's, for these like grindy decks that maybe struggle otherwise?
One thing that's also worth mentioning here, and it factors in a little bit when we're talking about Cube. It's not like the biggest strategic thing, but Scarab God is a fun card to play with. So, like,
yeah.
it is okay, I think, sometime to make concessions because cards are fun to play with and people enjoy them. Like, I don't hear people complaining about Scarab God's existence in the Cube. Like, I don't think I've ever heard someone say Scarab God is too good for the unrestricted cube. So as long as we're not hearing that backlash and people still enjoy playing with the card, I think it's acceptable. Whereas, like, who has ever been like, man, I sure, gee golly, do love Wurmcoil Engine being in this cube. Like,
right.
I'm willing to bet Doug put it in his deck one time and said that.
Yeah. But yeah, concessions for fun, I guess.
Wurmcoil, like, I know we keep like bringing this. I personally keep bringing this card up, but like, Wurmcoil Engine is one of those cards where, like, I've literally played it on curve and, like, apologized to my opponent because I feel bad that I played it, because if I had drawn, like, any other card, and this is true for, like, a variety of cards, but if I had drawn anything else, like, I should lose that game, and, like, Wurmcoil is the card that says, like, now you can't win. Whereas, like,
sorry, I got to do this.
I think
to
it's
you.
interesting that when I think about all of these cards, and maybe you guys don't, but do you guys ever just think of all these cards and just assume there's a couple of mana dorks in play and you played this on like turn 4? Like,
Yeah, sometimes.
like,
Worm Coil,
like,
yes.
In Grave Titan, Inferno Titan, Worm Coil Engine, like, I'm assuming Aquazots probably gets the same sort of thing where it's like, I'm assuming these cards are just like really, really good compared to like, but are much better if you put them in a deck with green cards.
For sure. What's that old joke? Worm Coil Engine is the best green 6-drop.
This is why this conversation kind of goes out the window when you're talking about Vintage Cube, right? Because then when you're introducing the combo reanimator sneak attack elements, it's like it doesn't matter what the mana costs on these cards are.
Yeah, that's like a good example. Like Worm Coil is like a totally fine and like maybe even not like a particularly strong card in environments where it's like, okay, cool, you played a giant lifelinker that's not going to immediately kill me. I'm going to combo you out with like Storm or something else that just doesn't care about your Worm Coil engine.
Yeah, I mean, you can still like turn 2, turn 3, tinker into a Worm Coil against fair decks, and that's pretty good. I mean, like, but then at that point, it's like, well, you also could have just tinkered into a Blightsteel Colossus probably, so,
right.
Or a Battle Ball. There's like a dozen different cards you could have tinkered into.
Here's my unfair thing. Like, what's your unfair?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So
I just wanted to track us back to the original question, which is like, is it okay to have like polarizing cards for weaker archetypes? I think what that question is really asking is it acceptable to have crazy power outliers in your weakest archetypes? And like my personal opinion is yes, with the caveat that I want those extremely powerful cards for weaker archetypes that consistently do a powerful thing rather than like shitting on a particular strategy.
Right, yeah, like Glissa rolls everybody equally. Like
exactly.
Glissa doesn't care. If you're a control deck, you've either got a Doom Blade or she draws cards. If you're an aggro deck, you either got Doom Blade or she brick walls your entire deck. Like
yeah, and if you're a green deck, you like almost can't beat it.
A good example of that, Chris, I don't know if you remember way back in the early Peasant Cube days, we had a problem with black being too powerful.
Right.
And one of our solutions, quote unquote, was to introduce Vinemare into the the cube, which Vinemare is a 4-mana 5/3.
Hexproof.
It has some sort of can't be interactive. It has blanket hexproof and it can't be blocked by black creatures. And it turns out that, yes, that's very good against black and pseudo solves a specific issue, but also Vinemare is miserable against all the other decks too. So you don't, it's not a solution to bring in like a hoser for one thing if that card is also, like, what if Boros was so good in our cube against Azorius and we were like, let's bring in Dream Trawler, which then is just incidentally good against every other deck. You know, right. You're just unraveling things at that point.
I think that this is like a topic that we should bring up in another episode, like a design-based episode. But I will say this, like, if you have an overperforming color, instead of introducing hosers for that color, which is either like you have it and it hoses them or you don't and it doesn't do anything, I think what you should probably do is actually look at the design of the problematic color and try to scale back its power in the areas where it's being problematic. Like what we ended up doing in the Peasant Cube eventually was instead of playing shit like Vinemare, we just realized that part of the problem was that black's removal was just way too efficient. And so we scaled back the efficiency of the removal, and that addressed the problem rather than playing cards that are like, this fucks you, or it's just a 5/3.
Right, and like it's just like when we had green just winning all the time. Like we took out Gargoth, we took out Foreign Collects and some of these other bangers, and now you play with Battle Mammoth, and Battle Mammoth is totally fine. It's still a good card. It still
still pretty good.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, so final question to wrap us up here. For us personally in our cube, obviously we're talking about this for a couple hours here. We want to avoid polarization in a lot of these different categories, but where do we find it acceptable? We've already noted that we find it acceptable in things like Grave Titan, Inferno Titan, like 6 mana and above, right? But we currently have cards like Inti in our cube. We have Nissa Who Shakes the World, which, in my personal opinion, that is an unreasonable card for our environment, but it's been around since day one and we've yet to cut it. So clearly there's something that's telling us this is acceptable. Like, what is the upper limit of acceptable?
I think partly with Nissa, it's because people expect it. Like, people know
the classicness of the card.
Yeah, it's like, it's one of those modern classics. It's just, you expect Nissa to be in the cube. It's the best 5 mana playing green. You win most of the games you resolve it in. It does ridiculous things, but also, like, it is beatable. It does make the game revolve around itself. It's really, really good against control. But the thing, I think one of the things that also saves this card is that green, it's really good against control for green, but otherwise green has such a miserable control matchup that you almost, like, Nissa is your out, right? It's like, otherwise you just get wrathed and, like, they basically...
Shores up a weakness.
Yeah, they basically, like, when they wrath you, right? The control deck, normally they don't get a lot of value. But when you wrath a green deck, you, like, double to triple stone rain them plus kill their threats.
Well, the other thing about this question is, like, we have talked about power outliers, which are, like, a little bit different than sort of the polarization I initially thought about us, like, talking about. But, like, I want to say that, like, the main thrust of this episode is just for new designers, like, trying to get them to consider whether or not cards that are excellent in some situations and terrible in others is the kind of gameplay that you want. This is, like, I think this is more of a question about, like, how much better than the average card do you want your power outliers to be, which is a polarization question in its very nature. But
I don't think Into Your Breaches are cards of, like, concern on polarization. They're just messed up Magic cards that win the game. It's like Schooner, right? Schooner isn't like some sort of polarizing card. I mean, it's a little better against control because it dodges wraths and sorcery speed removal. But outside of that, like, feature of every single vehicle ever, it isn't that it's good against one archetype and, like, bad against others. It's just a messed up card.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that, like, the power outlier discussion is tangentially related to the polarization discussion, right?
It's a very important discussion. I just don't think it's exactly what we're talking about here.
It's not exactly what we're talking about, but, like, just to, like, expound on it just, like, a little bit, like, Nissa Who Shakes the World is extremely polarizing if it's the only rare you're playing in your peasant cube. then it is a polarizing card, right?
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is, like, a question ultimately that's about power banding, and I think in our series about, like, building a cube for the first time or sort of general design principles for building a cube, like, I think this is a topic that we're going to explore in a lot more depth.
Yeah, I do think there's some cards around polarization that maybe could be discussed. I think some cards that I actually think have come up to mind lately are cards like Ephemerate, and partly this is because I just got completely savaged by it like 3 games in a row.
Yeah.
The other day, yeah. But, like, trying to play an interactive deck into Ephemerate is, like, it is a truly miserable experience. Your opponent just holds up 1 mana for the rest of the game, and, like, when you inevitably have to go for the removal spell, they, like, blink their thing and probably get value off of it as well, and then they, like, get more value on the next turn. It is rough. It's because it's hard to get someone to proactively use an Ephemerate, so you almost always have to, like, just play into it and hope they don't have it, and they always have it.
Yeah, sure. The delta for me with that, though, is that, like, Ephemerate actually does something proactively good for a strategy.
Yeah, it's a cool card,
regardless of what your opponent's doing.
But that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about, though, is that, like, Ephemerate is much, much better into, like, a removal heavy deck than it is into a deck that is just trying to beat you by combat, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my thing is that, like, in a Blink deck, Ephemerate is, like, literally never bad unless you don't have a creature on board, whereas some of the cards we've been talking about are excellent as sort of hate pieces against some strategies, and they're terrible against others. Like, Ephemerate's pretty much always going to be good in your Blink deck, and that's the difference for me.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess it depends on where you're going with it, because, like, also, there's other cards that I think about, like, for example, Starnheim is a card that, like, your generic creature decks almost can't beat on, like, when you put 2 4/4s into play, but, like, your control deck, it's just, like, a 5-mana card that gets mana leaked or whatever.
Yeah, and that's totally true, and actually at some point we may need to, like, take a look at Starnheim for that very reason.
Yeah, and this isn't me saying these cards are problematic inherently, it's more just thinking out loud. Like, I was just kind of, like, glancing at the list, and I was looking and, like, just thinking of cards we didn't talk about that are particularly polarizing, that are, like, really, really good into one matchup and pretty sketchy into other ones. And those were just 2 cards that kind of jumped out in white, for example, as cards that are, like, much, much better into specific matchups.
You can't construct a cube where every card is evenly powered against every other archetype, right? So like this isn't necessarily a design goal to cut every card that's good against one archetype. It's just you don't want the upper limits of those things where this card completely hoses this archetype and completely sucks against this one. Like, if you try to go through and say, you know what, this 3-mana 3/4 is really good against red, so I don't think I should play that. Like, that's not what we're talking about. You know, like, you're going to do that for every card and find, like, a niche where it's better against one deck or not. So that's not really worth anybody's effort from the cube design perspective to try and do.
Right. So to kind of, like, put a point on this topic and sort of summarize generally what we're talking about before we close this out is just as designers, especially as if you don't get a lot of reps with your cube and don't see the effects of these cards as like often enough to maybe come to these conclusions, I think that when you're designing your cube, you should really ask yourself, what is the acceptable level of polarity for your cards? And without applying this to every single context or say this is true for everybody, I'm not going to sit here and say, like, don't play highly polar cards in your cube. But if you're going to do that, I think it is important to put a lot of thought into whether or not that is appropriate for your context. Because playing highly polar cards in environments where that polarity is not necessary to check certain decks, it's going to produce really terrible feel-bad moments for your players when their entire game plan up to that point is just like invalidated by one card that is not particularly good in any other situation. So there are gameplay considerations here that's ultimately what it boils down to. Look through your list and see how many cards you're playing that just completely savage particular strategies, and ask yourself the question, is this actually the type of gameplay that I want to be cultivating in my cube?
Okay, so on to the main topic, snowlands in Cube. Let's talk about
Ice Fang Coatl.
Arkham's
snow
Astrolabe.
card. Blood on the snow. All right,
Pithing
that
Needle.
seems like a good. Yeah. Wait, did you say Pithing Needle?
Yeah, it's a snow card in my mind.
What? Okay. Cold Steel Heart. We do have Snow Card in our cube. Anyway, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks, as always, to everyone listening. Remember, best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback. Great place to hang out with like-minded individuals. Talk about Cube, Retail Limited, all things Magic. Think of it like your online LGS. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. And just to go over the revised schedule of our draft events again, unrestricted cubes happen on Sunday and Wednesday nights. Peasant cube drafts happen on Saturday nights. We have an F&M style draft where players can vote between a number of different cubes on Friday nights. And then we have our Jank Diver Gaming Evergreen cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings. This is all Eastern Standard Time, either 2:30 in the morning / or afternoon / 7:30.
Morning is a real
It's
stretch.
morning for me.
Is
It's
a
morning
stretch
for
here,
me.
okay?
Thank you. Sorry. Teld gave me a look when I said morning, but that's still like
It's 11:30
noon
for you.
me.
Yeah.
Early afternoon for the early ones, and then 7:30 Eastern for the later ones. So 6 total events, plus maybe every now and then an ad hoc event for people who are trying to do that.
So if you join the Discord server, we actually have a channel called Draft Schedule, and it lays out what is going to be played on which days and time slots in the Draft Schedule channel. So if you come check out the Discord, this is all going to be laid out for you in a very easy to parse format.
Additionally, when you sign up on the Discord, every day when we do the drafts, we make an announcement. So there'll be a draft announcements page that'll have like a reminder that, hey, this is the drafts on offer today. So it's much easier once you're here to like, I know that's a lot like Chris said, but once you're on the Discord, it's pretty straightforward. You just see the draft. If you would like to play, you click to sign up.
Yeah, I mostly just wrote it out to make it sound like we do a lot of stuff.
We do
a lot of stuff.
Yeah, those announcements that go up will have varying degrees of humor in them, depending on who made the announcement. But
Tim's the best at it. I suck. I'm just like, here's when the draft is happening, and you should be there.
You can tell I'm having a bad day if I make the thing and I'm just like, here's the sign up, y'all.
Okay, well, if I see that, I'll call you. How about that?
Give him a courtesy check.
Yeah, our socials, Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, where I have a recent Murders at Karlov Manor draft that I think was actually very entertaining and got to do some cool things. Teld also posted the Peasant Cube update video for Murders at Karlov Manor, complete with detective hats and goat noises.
We even had a cameo by a very famous member of the community.
Captain Pinchy made a cameo there. You can find Teld streaming at twitch.tv/Teld Talks. That's going to go ahead and do it. Everybody have a good Super Bowl weekend, Taylor Swift weekend, and or Valentine's Day, and we'll catch you all in a couple weeks. Okay, Chris, I have a sign-off that's kind of directed towards you here, but we can get Teld's input on some stuff here. A couple months ago, I think you dug up the original unrestricted cube list.
Yeah.
And I think since we were talking about some cube design, I wanted to just pinpoint. I pulled out 10 cards from the original unrestricted cube list that we have some explaining to do about. And now, before we talk about those cards, I just want to preface by saying, like, we were working with a much more restrictive card pool at the time.
Way more.
As evidenced by some of these cards, we didn't know exactly what we were doing. But number one, and this one is actually not super egregious. You actually, I think, had a lot of reasons for wanting to play this card, but Shared Summons, the 5-mana green spell instant that can fetch 2 creatures, just would be unacceptable.
Pretty bad.
Yeah. We wanted Flash to happen. We wanted blue-green Flash to happen.
I really did. Frilled Mystic was in here.
I love when WotC throws like one random Flash card, like Repulsive Mutation, in the set just to like get Chris's hopes up, only to be inevitably disappointed.
They really fucked us in Midnight Hunt. Never mind. Anyway.
Yeah, I was like, I know where he's going with this. Okay, number 2, Dark Dweller Oracle. This is a 2-mana 2/2
it's really
in red.
bad.
You can pay a mana to sack a creature to Impulse Draw, which, by the way, was downgraded from rare to common in its most recent printing.
Oh, this was M19. The power level in M19 was so low.
It's interesting because I don't even know if that card would make the Peasant Cube at this point.
No, I don't think so. It would be terrible. It's terrible. It's terrible, man. Number 3, and we've come a long way since this one, straight up Glorious Anthem. 1 white enchantment, give all your creatures +1/+1. Which, by the way, after playing limited, War Leader's Call is insane.
That card is messed up. That card is messed up.
You would be surprised how much like just adding extra damage onto Glorious Anthem, even for another color, makes it like extremely playable.
Yeah, Chris, here's the play pattern. You play the Glorious Anthem, and then you attack your opponent, and then they're like, I'm at 3 now. And then you're like, hey, guess what? I got 3 creatures.
Yeah. I really want it to be good, so I'm glad to hear that.
Number 4, Helm of the Host.
Yeah, okay, so let me try to explain. Oh, and Sorcerer's Spyglass, Jesus Christ. So when we first started working on these cubes, there were 2 things going on. I didn't really know what we were doing, so there were cards that I saw show up in They Shall Remain Nameless, but certain content creators' lists that I was like, well, if it's good enough there, it has to be good enough here. And then as our card evaluation skills advanced, I just kind of realized they're absolutely not, and that probably shouldn't be in that list I was referencing. But another thing was, I tried to base our color proportions, including colorless, with other cubes I was looking at, because I was really, really drawing from these templates to try to, like, guide me early. We had 44 colorless cards, including Icy fucking Manipulator and a Chromis Memoriam.
For those listening at home, there are now 8 colorless cards in the cube, and one of them is Ugin.
Yeah, it's literally 8 colorless cards now. God, we had Lithoform Engine in here.
The thing too is Helm of the Host was actually playable too, right? Like, just that's the way we had sculpted our environment.
Well, it was so slow because the aggressive threats were like so bad and so few in number. Like, we were playing Healer's Hawk in white as an aggressive creature.
I play Viashino Pyromancer. Do 2 to your face.
You mentioned Helm of the Host getting stuck on an Agent of Treachery once. Like, that's just the kind of environment.
Yeah, my brother beat me once in like a Bant ramp deck because, again, the aggressive, like, Ugin used to be the God Emperor of this cube because the quote-unquote fast decks were not fast enough to prevent your opponent from eventually playing it, and it just wins the game. So it's gone from like niche card in like super ramp decks and certain styles of control deck that are taking mana rocks. It's gone to that from like Ugin was the first pick card in the environment.
Number 5, our green top end card in the cube was Sandworm Convergence.
I love that card.
Is that the enchantment that makes 5/5s?
Yep, and flyers can't attack you. That was the top end green card that we had in the same cube, mind you, that had Ugin as the best card, also at 8 mana.
To when all of our accelerations started on turn 2. Which
don't worry, we'll get the Craterhoof versus Endrace Forerunners sign off one of these days. But it won't be today. It won't be today.
Kill me.
Number 6, this one's actually not like egregious, but it definitely has not held up. Hypnotic Spectre, which looking back at the cube, I didn't even know Hypnotic Spectre was on Arena, and we played this in our cube.
Yeah, we did. It was reprinted in some anthology, and this is another one of those cards where I would see it in like really old cube lists, and I was like, well, if it's good enough there, it has to be good enough here. First of all, the gameplay patterns on Hypnotic Spectre suck because like it either makes them discard a random land or it makes them discard the best card.
Would you say it's polarizing?
I would say it's polarizing.
It's like the blue-black 3-drop that does the like each your opponent's
that one's
cards
good,
enter the deck,
and
right?
it's blue-black.
It's like it's just that. It's like, all right, either you have shock and you tempo me out, or you don't, and like this game is over.
It's kind of funny that the art on this one, it's a specter, but the art is a fucking dragon. But yeah, the other thing about Hypnotic Spectre is like I was not aware that people were playing it in their vintage cubes, because if you like Black Lotus this out on turn 1, it just like really completely took over the game.
Wow, what a time to be alive. That would not be good even today. That would not be good anymore.
No, but it used to be, and like
Old
Hypnotic
school.
Spectre is like really powerful if you play it super early, and then if you draw it in the late game when your opponent's holding like no cards, it's just awful.
I do have to say I'm a little disappointed now that I thought about it that MKM didn't have a card called Hypnotic Inspector and give it a little detective hat.
Oh yeah, that would have been great actually.
They missed up Crocodile, right? That should have been Investigator. But anyway, number 7, blue card draw has not come a long way since this, but we were on Precognitive Perception.
Oh,
5 mana, instant, draw 3, but if you cast it as a sorcery, you scry 3 first, because that's what you want to do, is cast your 5 mana, draw 3 as a sorcery.
Yeah, compare this to like Intrude on the
Multiverse,
yeah.
even.
Just the addendum upside of like, play your card poorly and you get some scry for it is great.
Tap out for 5 mana and don't impact the board as a blue deck.
Yeah. The last 3 are pretty janky. Number 8, Nyx Fleece Ram.
Okay, Nyx Fleece Ram is good, and you need to keep that out of your mouth. It is a good card.
2 mana, 0/5 enchantment creature, gain a life on the beginning of each of your turns.
Nyx Fleece Ram is dope.
Yeah, well,
It's a
I
cool
agree
card.
that it's dope. I like it in our Neo Cube where like enchantments matter, but it's like it's kind of hilarious. Not only is this card just like not good enough for high power unrestricted environments, but it like perfectly fits the definition of polarity we just like belabored for the last hour and a half.
All right, number 9, Justice Strike, which is red-white. For an instant, target creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. And I just as an asterisk to Justice Strike, we also had Phyrexian Obliterator in this cube. And if you Justice Strike a Phyrexian Obliterator, the Obliterator deals 5 to itself, and the controller of the Obliterator has to sacrifice 5 permanents after the Obliterator dies.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that fucking Obliterator's like impossible to cast outside of mono black, but if you resolve it, it just like dominates the board.
Number 10, and I don't even know what this card does, but I know it's bad. Captain's Hook.
Is that the pirate equipment? It's like it's like short sword or something, or worse?
If it becomes unattached, I think you sack the creature that it's attached to.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, it's 3 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0 in menace, which is like not a bad combination of stats, but it's not amazing either. For whatever reason, the creature is a pirate in addition to its other types. So like, you can slap it on a dinosaur, it puts a hook on its hand, and all of a sudden it's saying Yar and
or
boarding
you can
boats.
put it on a crab token.
Yeah. Oh, Crab Pirate. That's
What's
awesome.
the equip cost on? Is it 2?
1. It's
1.
one.
Okay. It has a reasonable equip cost, but you can't even move it around because you'll just
No,
kill
you
your own
can't,
things.
because it just... I guess the flavor is, like, the hand gets replaced with a hook, and when you take the hook off, like, the creature's useless or something.
Don't you... If you put the hook on, your hand is already presumably cauterized or whatever, right? Like, do pirates take their hook off and they're like, I'm dead?
I mean, honestly, did it in modern day Magic, because, like, Ixalan's a pretty old set at this point. In modern day Magic, like... Would a 3 mana equipment that equips for 1 and gives +2/+0 in menace without the sacrifice a permanent clause like even be anywhere close to good?
You could have stopped it. You could have stopped at 3 mana equipment.
Maybe at 2 mana. At 2 mana, I could see that being like justifiable without the sacrifice clause on it. But even then, you still wouldn't play it. There was a time we went through a red-white equipment phase in this cube. Like, we tried to do red-white equipment, and it just didn't pan out. And maybe it would pan out better these days. There's so much more support for it. But we
need like 3 more barbed batter fists before I want to approach that. Like, you know,
I don't even want it.
That one's actually like competitive, at least.
Unrestricted Cube was a wild time when we first started. I left Zakama off this list because Zakama's actually kind of cool, but my very first, one of my very first drafts, I drafted a Sultai deck with a single copy of Cultivate, a single copy of Migration Route or Migration Path, 1 Plains, 1 Mountain, and a Zakama in my deck, and just fetched up those 2 lands every time and cast Zakama in my Sultai deck. Like, this is the type of environment we had.
Oh, goodness.
we used to be a society. Look at us now.
Yeah, we had. I'm just looking over these colorless cards. We used to play Voltaic Servant.
Yes, for the Traxos combo.
For the Traxos, which Traxos was like terrible to begin with. Oh yeah, and we had Shadow Spear, which like it's fun to bring up because it's also an example of like a really polar card. Like in a green deck, you just slap this on a huge creature, and like your aggro opponent can never win, and like your control opponent just doesn't really give a shit about
that goes back to big lifelink thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff. Crawl Harpooner. Oh my. Okay, I'll stop now.
The card with text that doesn't matter.
Yeah, that one.
The card pool was limited. I just want to emphasize the card pool was a lot more limited. we learned a lot, but yeah, thanks for the stroll down memory lane there.
The card pool's always limited. If it wasn't, we'd be playing constructed.
Thank you, Teld.
Anytime.
All right, we'll be back next week with a discussion on Snowlands.
All right, take care, everybody.
You're just dead if I flunge.
Taylor Swift farted and it smelled like perfume.
Go get your cleave.
You just could put it in a trash can, right?
That's dog shit.
I'm dead.
Elsie, I hurt me.
You really kind of shit the bed.
Flunge into it.
2 to your face.
Sure, gee golly, do love Worm Coil Engine.